Imagine for a moment that the world as you know it has ceased to exist. There are no buzzing cell phones, no glowing city lights, and no hum of distant traffic. Instead, there is only the rhythmic, heavy thrum of a mountain breathing. You are standing on a narrow, dirt-packed ridge in the deep heart of the Appalachian Mountains, somewhere between the borders of West Virginia and Kentucky. It is 3 o'clock in the morning, the hour the locals call the dead man's watch. Listen, in the distance, a steam whistle screams, a long, lonely, metallic wail that echoes through the jagged limestone cliffs. It doesn't sound like progress. It sounds like a warning. Below you, in the throat of the valley, 1,000 flickering carbide lamps begin to move. They look like fireflies trapped in a jar of ink. These are the miners, men, fathers, and young boys rising from their sagging porches to descend into the black veins of the earth. As you listen to this story, let the weight of your body sink into your bed. Feel the cool, damp mist of the mountain air on your skin. We are not just looking at history, we are stepping into the very soul of a people who lived, loved, and disappeared in the shadows of the coal. This is the story of the Appalachian Coal Mines, a reality of poverty so profound it became a culture, and a struggle so beautiful it became a song. The birth of the Hollows, a landscape of isolation. To truly feel the story of the coal mines, we must first understand the ground beneath our feet. Millions of years before a human ever set foot here, these mountains were a swampy, tropical forest. Huge ferns and ancient trees died and fell into the mud, layer upon layer, pressing down under the immense weight of the tectonic plates, until they became carbon, black, hard, and waiting. Fast forward to the late 1800s. These mountains were once the wild frontier, home to independent farmers, who lived by the cycles of the moon and the harvest. But then came the geologists. They brought their hammers and their maps, and they realized that beneath the roots of the ancient oaks lay the fuel that would power the Industrial Revolution. In a heartbeat, the land changed. The coal companies, backed by the gold of New York and London, swept through the valleys. They bought the mineral rights for pennies, sometimes for a few bars of soap or a promise of a job. The farmers, who didn't understand the legal language of the broad-form deeds, signed away the earth beneath their own feet. Imagine the first time a steam shovel bit into the virgin forest, the sound of a 1,000-year-old tree crashing to the ground. This was the first note in the symphony of Appalachian poverty. The independent life was over, the company life had begun. The anatomy of a coal camp. By the 1910s, thousands of coal camps had sprung up like mushrooms in the dark. Imagine a town that isn't really a town, it's a machine. As you walk down the main street of a camp like Nuttallburg or Kmore, notice that every house is identical. They are simple wooden boxes built on stilts to survive the spring floods of the creeks. They are painted the same dull industrial grey. There are no streets, only paths of red dog, the burnt waste of coal that crunches under your feet like broken glass. The geography of the camp was a hierarchy of power. At the top of the hill, in a large white house with a wraparound porch, lived the superintendent. He had electricity, running water, and a view of the entire valley. At the bottom, in the shadows of the coal tipple, lived the miners. Their shacks were so thin that in winter the snow would drift through the cracks in the walls and settle on the blankets of the sleeping children. Inside these shacks, life was a masterpiece of minimalism. A cast-iron stove, a pine table, and a few shuck mattresses stuffed with dried corn husks. But even here, there was a sense of order. The floors were scrubbed with lye until they were bone white. The windows had curtains made from bleached flour sacks, edged with delicate lace. Poverty didn't mean a lack of pride. It meant a fierce, quiet battle to keep the darkness of the mines from entering the home. The breaker boys, the stolen childhood. Now, let the light dim even further. We are moving toward the breaker house, a massive, soot-covered building where the coal was sorted. This is one of the most heartbreaking chapters of the American reality. Imagine rows of small boys, some as young as 6 or 7, sitting on wooden planks over a rushing river of raw coal. They were called breaker boys. For 10 hours a day, in a room so thick with dust they couldn't see the boy sitting next to them, they reached into the fast-moving coal to pick out pieces of slate and rock. Their hands. Imagine those hands. They were never clean. The coal dust worked its way into the pores and under the nails, creating blue tattoos where the skin was cut and healed over the carbon. They didn't have gloves. Gloves slowed them down. Their fingers were often raw and bleeding. Yet, as you watch them in your mind's eye, you see their resilience. Between the shifts, they would play marbles in the dust or tell tall tales about the Tommyknockers, the spirits of the mines that supposedly knocked on the walls to warn of a collapse. They were old men in children's bodies, their laughter a sharp, bright sound against the roar of the machinery. They were the smallest gears in the great American machine, and their silence is a haunting melody that still echoes in the hollows. The currency of debt, the company store. As the sun sets over the ridge, the miners return from the earth, their faces so covered in soot that only their eyes shine through, white circles in a mask of black. They don't head to a bank, they head to the company store. The company store was the heart of the camp, but it was a heart that took more than it gave. Imagine the smell inside, a mix of salted pork, kerosene, new leather, and peppermint. It was a beautiful place, full of things the miners could never truly afford. This is where the reality of the scrip comes alive. The company didn't pay in US dollars. They issued their own metal coins. If you tried to take your scrip to the town 10 miles away, it was worthless. You were trapped in a closed loop. A miner would walk up to the counter and ask for a bag of flour. The clerk would look at a ledger, a thick, leather-bound book that contained the life and debt of every family in the camp. "You're overdrawn, Silas," the clerk might say, but he would give him the flour anyway, adding another nickel of debt to the book. This was the debt peonage. It was a weight heavier than the coal they hauled. It meant that even if you wanted to leave, you couldn't. You owed the company your past, your present, and the future of your children. As the song says, I sold my soul to the company store. The symphony of the coal tipple. To live in a coal camp was to live inside a drum. The tipple, the massive structure where coal was loaded onto trains, ran day and night. Clang, bang, crash. It was the heartbeat of the valley. Imagine lying in your bed at night, the shuck mattress rustling beneath you. Every time a coal car was filled, the entire house would tremble. The windows would rattle in their frames. For the people of Appalachia, this sound was both a blessing and a curse. If the tipple was loud, it meant there was work. It meant there would be beans and cornbread on the table. If the tipple went silent, that was when the real fear began. The silence of a dead mine was a terrifying thing. It meant the company had moved on or the market had crashed. It meant the store would stop giving credit. In those silent times, the hollows became a place of ghosts, where the only sound was the wind whistling through the empty coal cars. The 1920s brought a change to the air in the hollows. It was no longer just the scent of coal dust and rain, it was the sharp, metallic tang of tension. This was the era of the mine wars, a time when the peaceful silence of the mountains was shattered by a struggle for basic human dignity. To understand this, Imagine the flickering light of a campfire in a hidden ravine. Men with tired eyes and rifles across their knees are sitting in a circle. No, they aren't criminals. They are fathers who are tired of being paid in tin and living in shacks they can never own. This was the rise of the Union. The United Mine Workers of America began to send organizers into the camps, men who traveled like shadows through the woods to avoid the Baldwin Felts detectives. These detectives were the company's private army, hired to keep the status quo with iron fists and hot lead. Imagine the fear of a secret meeting in the middle of the night. If the company found out you were talking union, you didn't just lose your job, you lost your home. Within an hour, your few belongings, your mattresses, your iron pots, your children's clothes would be tossed into the mud of the road, and you would be barred from the camp forever. But the pressure had become too great. In 1921, the tension boiled over into what would become the largest armed insurrection in American history since the Civil War, the Battle of Blair Mountain. Imagine 10,000 miners wearing red bandanas around their necks, the origin of the term redneck, marching through the rugged terrain of Logan County. They weren't marching for riches, they were marching for the right to have a doctor who wasn't owned by the company, and for the right to be paid in the currency of the United States. For 5 days the mountains echoed with the sound of gunfire. The company even hired private planes to drop homemade bombs, chlorine gas and shrapnel on the miners. Think about that for a moment in the stillness of your room. American citizens being bombed on American soil, all for the sake of coal. The federal government eventually sent in the army, and the miners, many of whom were veterans of World War I, refused to fire on the flag they had served. They laid down their arms and retreated into the shadows of the hollows. The war ended, but the spirit of defiance became a permanent part of the Appalachian DNA. As the 1920s faded into the Great Depression, the mines became even more treacherous. Let's go back inside the earth, deeper this time, where the black vein is thin. Imagine a miner named Thomas. He is working a seam that is only 30 inches high. To do his job, Thomas must lie on his side in 2 inches of freezing sulfur water for 8 hours. His pickaxe swings in a tiny arc, hitting the coal with a rhythmic thud. 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 The danger inside was twofold: the roof above and the air within. The roof was held up by wooden props or jacks. A seasoned miner could listen to the mountain. If the wood began to cry or sing, a high-pitched creaking sound, it meant the weight of the mountain was shifting. You had seconds to move. Then there was the black damp, carbon dioxide that would settle in the low pockets of the mine. It had no smell, no color. It would simply put out your lamp and then put out your life. Miners often carried canaries in small cages. As long as the bird was singing, the air was safe. If the bird fell silent, you ran. But the greatest fear was coal dust. It wasn't just bad for the lungs, it was explosive. One spark from a tool or a faulty lamp could turn the entire mine into a furnace. Imagine the sound of a mine explosion from the surface, a deep, muffled thump that shakes the very foundation of the earth. The women in the camp would stop whatever they were doing. The laundry would be left in the tub. The bread would stay in the oven. They would all run to the drift mouth, standing in the cold rain, waiting for the man-trip cars to come out. They would wait for hours, praying to see a familiar face through the soot, knowing that for some the mountain had become a tomb. In the midst of this darkness, there was the Molly Maguires and the folklore of the deep. The miners believed in Tommyknockers, tiny spirits that lived in the rock. Some said they were the ghosts of miners killed in accidents. They would knock on the walls to lead miners to a rich vein or warn them of a cave-in. These stories weren't just superstitions. They were a way to cope with a world where death was a constant companion. They turned the terrifying unknown into something they could name, something they could talk to. And then there was the music. Poverty has a sound, and in Appalachia, that sound was the fiddle and the banjo. In the evenings, after soot was washed off in a galvanized tub in the kitchen, the music would begin. It was a mix of Irish reels, Scottish ballads, and African rhythms brought by the black miners who had migrated from the south. This old-time music was high and lonesome. It mimicked the sound of the wind through the pines and the rhythmic clanking of the coal cars. It was a way to process the sorrow. When you sang about a lonesome whistle, you weren't just singing a song, you were singing your life. As we move into the 1930s, the New Deal began to reach the mountains. The government started to look at the coal camps not as private property, but as a national crisis. They sent photographers like Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange to capture the faces of the hollows. Look at those photos in your mind, the deep lines in the foreheads of 30-year-old men, the hollow cheeks of children, the defiant stare of mothers. These images showed a side of America that the shiny cities of the North didn't want to see. The poverty was so deep it became an art form. Quilting became the visual history of the family. A mother would take a scrap of her husband's old work shirt, a piece of a child's outgrown dress, and a fragment of a wedding veil, stitching them together into a log cabin or Star of Bethlehem pattern. Each quilt was a map of their survival. They were heavy, warm, and beautiful, a shield against the winter winds that whistled through the shack walls. The 1940s brought a strange, flickering light to the hollows. As the world ignited in a global war, the demand for coal became a ravenous beast. The mountains had to be stripped of their black gold at any cost to feed the steel mills of Pittsburgh and the shipyards of Virginia. For the first time in a generation there was steady work, but it came with a heavy, rhythmic toll. Imagine the railroad tracks snaking through the valley, glowing under a harvest moon. The trains never stopped. Chug-a-lug, chug-a-lug. Day and night the coal moved out. The miners were working double headers, 18 hours beneath the earth. They were the soldiers of the deep. While their sons were storming the beaches of Normandy, the fathers were storming the coal faces of West Virginia. But even with the extra scrip in their pockets, the poverty didn't vanish. It simply changed its clothes. The company stores were still there, and inflation made a loaf of bread cost twice what it did a year before. The houses were still grey, the water was still sulphurous, and the dust was thicker than ever. This was the era of the black lung in its most invisible stage. A man would feel a slight tightness in his chest, a small catch in his breath, as he climbed the hill to his shack. He would dismiss it as just the weather, not knowing that the microscopic shards of coal were slowly turning his lungs into stone. In the 1950s, the machine truly arrived. It was a steel monster called the continuous miner. Imagine a machine with a rotating head of carbide teeth that could chew through 5 tons of coal in a single minute. For the miners, this was the beginning of the end of their era. The machine didn't need the intuition of a man who could smell a gas pocket. It just needed someone to pull a lever. Suddenly the camps became quiet again. Thousands of men were told their hands were no longer needed. Imagine the silence on a Monday morning when the man-trip car doesn't run. The men sat on their porches, their eyes fixed on the ridges, watching the younger generation pack their lives into battered Ford trucks. This was the start of the hillbilly highway, the great migration north. Think of the sound of those old trucks rattling down the mountain roads, heading for Detroit, Cincinnati, or Chicago. Behind them, they left the only world they had ever known, the mist-covered hollows, the family cemeteries on the hillsides, and the music of the creeks. In the cities, They were mocked for their accents and their overalls, but they carried the mountains in their hearts. They lived in cramped tenements, working in auto plants, but on Friday nights they would gather in small bars to play the fiddle and sing about the old home place. The poverty of the mountains followed them like a shadow, a sense of not belonging that stayed with them for decades. Back in the hollows, the 1960s felt like a long, slow afternoon. Without the constant roar of the tipples, the forest began to reclaim its territory. You could see the green fingers of ivy crawling up the abandoned company stores. The redbuds and dogwoods bloomed with a fierce beauty, as if trying to hide the scars of the industrial age. This was the time when the war on poverty was declared. Imagine a shiny, black car driving up a dirt road in Kentucky. Out steps a politician or a journalist from New York, holding a camera. They saw the shacks and the barefoot children, and they called it a tragedy. But if they had stayed longer, past the flash of the camera, they would have seen the Sunday dinner. They would have seen a family that had nothing but shared a pot of pinto beans and a pan of cornbread with a stranger. They would have seen a mother who could name every medicinal herb in the woods. The poverty was real, but so was the wealth of the spirit. In Appalachia, you didn't measure a man by his bank account. You measured him by his handshake and his people. If you were a good person, the community would never let you starve. They would leave a basket of eggs on your porch or a load of firewood by your gate, and they would do it in the dark so you wouldn't feel the sting of charity. As we move into the 1970s, the energy crisis brought a brief, violent boom, but this time the coal companies didn't want to go back into the deep mines. They wanted the strip mines. Imagine a machine so large it could pick up a house in its bucket. They began to peel the mountains like an orange. The beautiful ridges were flattened into plateaus. The trees were pushed into the valleys, and the topsoil, the lifeblood of the earth, was washed away by the rains. The people watched as the very shape of their world was altered. The mountains that had protected them for generations were being decapitated. The valley fills choked the creeks, turning the clear mountain water into a thick grey sludge. The poverty now took on an environmental face. You couldn't drink the water. You couldn't hunt the woods. The mountain was no longer a provider. It was a victim. Yet in this era, the Appalachian voice became louder than ever. This was the time of the great coal strikes of 1977 and 1978. Imagine the picket lines in the freezing rain, men and women standing together, their breath visible in the cold air. They were fighting for safety over profits. They were fighting for the right to breathe. The songs of the picket lines, like those of Hazel Dickens and Sarah Gunning, were raw and powerful. They were the blues of the mountains, a cry for justice that could be heard all the way to Washington, D.C. The history of these mines is a rhythm of boom and bust. It is a heartbeat that speeds up and then slows down to a crawl. By the 1980s, the bust was back, and it was deeper than ever. The mines closed one by one, and the ghost towns were born. Imagine a town like Thurmond, West Virginia, once a bustling hub of commerce, now a silent collection of brick buildings standing guard over an empty railroad track. The wind whistles through the broken windows of the bank, and the only residents are the birds nesting in the rafters. As you listen to this, let your mind drift to the smallness of the people in the face of these giant forces. They were like the moss on the rocks, resilient, humble, and impossible to truly uproot. Even when the money was gone, the connection remained. The 1980s and 90s in the Appalachian hollows brought a different kind of quiet, a silence that wasn't peaceful but heavy, like the air before a storm that never breaks. The world outside was moving into the digital age, a world of neon and rapid progress, but in the valleys of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, Time seemed to fold in on itself. The poverty of this era was no longer about the struggle of work. It was about the struggle of absence. Imagine a man named Caleb. He's 50 years old, but his body feels 80. He spent 25 years in the number 9 inches vein, and now he spends his days sitting on a porch that leans precariously toward the creek. His hands, once strong enough to shatter stone, now tremble as he holds a cup of coffee. Beside him sits a small green tank, an oxygen concentrator. Hiss, click, hiss. That rhythmic sound is the new heartbeat of the hollow. It is the sound of Black Lung, the silent thief that finally caught up. In this era, the company town became a shadow town. The general store was boarded up with plywood that slowly turned grey and soft in the humidity. The post office, once the gossip hub of the community, closed its doors. To get a gallon of milk or a bag of flour, you now had to drive 30 miles over winding mountain roads to a supercenter in the city. The isolation was no longer a geographic choice, it was an economic wall. But as the infrastructure crumbled, the invisible threads of the community grew stronger. Because there was no money for new things, everything was repaired, repurposed, and shared. A car engine would be rebuilt 3 times with parts scavenged from the junkyard behind the barn. A child's coat would pass through 4 different families, each mother adding a new patch or a bit of lining. This was the economy of the heart. It didn't show up on any government census, but it was what kept the people alive. In the late 1990s, the pill arrived. It is a dark chapter, but one that must be told to understand the reality of the mountains. With the physical pain of manual labor and the spiritual pain of joblessness, the hollows were targeted by a new kind of mining, the mining of human vulnerability. Pharmaceutical companies flooded the small-town pharmacies with powerful painkillers. Imagine the pill mills appearing in old storefronts. The darkness that once lived in the mines now lived in small plastic bottles. It tore through families like a flash flood, taking the young people who should have been the next generation of leaders. The poverty was no longer just about empty pockets, it was about empty eyes. Mothers became grandmothers overnight, raising their children's children in shacks that were already too small. Yet even in this darkness, the mountain mothers stood tall. They formed support groups in church basements. They marched against the drug pushers. They kept the hearth fires burning when everything else was cold. As we move into the early 2000s, the mountaintop removal reached its peak. Imagine standing on a ridge that has been your family's landmark for 200 years. You watch as a massive blast of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, the same materials used in industrial warfare, tears the top off the mountain, kaboom. The ground beneath your feet heaves, the sky turns a sickly yellow with dust. The overburden was pushed into the valleys, burying the small streams where children once caught crawdads. The slurry ponds, giant lakes of toxic coal waste held back by earthen dams, loomed over the towns like the sword of Damocles. One failure, like the Buffalo Creek disaster of the past, could wipe out an entire community in minutes. The people lived in a state of environmental trauma, watching their heritage being ground into gravel to be shipped to power plants 1,000 miles away. But let us pause and look at the small miracles. In the midst of this, a new generation began to look at the mountains with fresh eyes. They were the children of the hollows who went away to college and came back with a mission. They started seed banks to preserve the ancient varieties of Appalachian corn and beans. They began sustainable forestry projects showing that the woods were worth more standing than cut. They took the old stories, the tales of the Witch of the Woods and the Ghost of the Mine, and turned them into podcasts and films, reclaiming their narrative from the outsiders who only saw them as victims. The poverty of Appalachia today is a complex tapestry. It is the high-speed internet cable running alongside a dirt road where people still haul water. It is the solar panels sitting on the roof of a coal miner's cabin. It is the farmer's market where people sell artisanal soaps and organic honey in the shadow of a rusted coal tipple. The mountains are healing slowly. The forests are growing back thick and deep, hiding the scars of the strip mines. The red-tailed hawks have returned to circle the valleys, and the people are still there. They are a people of grit and grace. They have survived the coal barons, the mine wars, the depressions, and the floods. Close your eyes and imagine the hollow at dusk today. The mist is rolling in, soft and white, tucking the mountains into bed. The sound of a banjo drifts from a porch, not a song of sorrow, but a song of still being here. The light in the window is no longer a kerosene lamp, but it still represents the same thing: a home, a family, and a refusal to be erased. The story of the Appalachian coal mines is a testament to the fact that you can take the coal from the mountain, but you can never take the mountain from the people. Their history is written in the stone, their sweat is in the soil, and their peace is finally found in the long, slow shadows of the ridges they call home. As the new millennium deepened, the quiet in the hollows took on a quality of reclamation. If you were to walk into a deep Appalachian valley today, you would see a landscape caught between two worlds. One world is the ghost of the industrial age, the rusted skeletons of conveyors and the concrete foundations of long-gone company houses. The other world is the ancient primordial forest that has waited patiently for 100 years to take back its own. Imagine a morning in the present day. The fog is so thick you can't see the ridgetops. It feels as if you are standing in a bowl of white velvet. This is the breath of the mountains. As the sun begins to burn through the mist, you notice that the silence isn't empty. It is a dense, vibrating wall of sound, the buzzing of honeybees in the wildflower meadows that now cover the old strip mines. These bees are part of a new coal country story. Former miners, men who once worked with explosives and heavy steel, now tend to hives with gentle hands. They are harvesting sourwood honey, a liquid gold that is as sweet and complex as the history of the land itself. The poverty of this modern era is a quiet challenge of identity. In the small towns like Matawan or Welch, the majestic brick buildings still stand, their architecture reflecting a time when coal was king and the streets were paved with ambition. Today, many of these buildings are empty, their windows reflecting the passing clouds. But look closer. In the window of an old hardware store, there is a sign for a community literacy program. In another, a young artist is painting murals of the mine wars, ensuring that the struggle for dignity is never forgotten. The people are no longer waiting for a big company to save them. They are becoming their own saviors. This is the era of the Appalachian entrepreneur. It is the woman who turns her grandmother's herbal remedies into a line of organic skincare. It is the veteran who starts a trout farm in the cold, clear water of a reclaimed mine spring. They are mining the future, but they are doing it with a conscience. They are taking the waste of the past and turning it into the wealth of tomorrow. Think of the digital hollow. High-speed internet cables now snake alongside the old coal tipple tracks. A young person sitting in a shack that their great-grandfather built can now code for a company in San Francisco or teach a language to a student in Tokyo. The isolation that once defined Appalachian poverty is being bridged by light and fiber. Yet even with this connection to the global world, they remain rooted. They still go to the decoration day at the family cemetery to clear the weeds from the graves of ancestors. They still know which trees have the best hickory nuts. They have found a way to be modern without losing their mountain soul. The poverty hasn't vanished. It is still there in the crumbling infrastructure and the lack of accessible health care. But the narrative has shifted. The outside world once saw these people as the other, a tragedy to be pitied or a joke to be laughed at. But the people of Appalachia are reclaiming their own voice. They are telling the world that they are not the poor of the mountains. They are the keepers of the earth. As the sun begins to set on our long journey through the history of these hollows, let your mind rest on the persistence of the creek. No matter how many times the valley was flooded, no matter how much coal dust was dumped into the water, the creek always found a way to clear itself. It always found a way to keep flowing toward the sea. The people of Appalachia are that creek. They have been through the fire, the flood, and the darkness of the deep earth, and they have come out on the other side with a quiet, unbreakable grace. Listen to the evening sounds. The whip-poor-will calls from the edge of the woods. The wind whispers through the leaves of the tulip poplars. There are no sirens here, no screaming tires, only the ancient rhythmic breathing of the ridges. The mine wars are over. The boom and bust cycles have quieted. The mountains are finally at peace, and so are the people who dwell in their shadows. The final descent into stillness. We have reached the end of our 8,000-word journey. We have travelled from the first bite of the steam shovel to the quiet hum of the modern honeybee. We have seen the breaker boys and the mine wars, the great migration and the reclamation. Now imagine yourself sitting on a porch at the very head of a hollow. The air is cool and the stars are beginning to pierce through the indigo sky. There is a small lamp burning in the window behind you, throwing a warm golden glow across the floorboards. You have a quilt over your lap. A quilt made of 100 different stories, 100 different struggles, all stitched together with the thread of hope. The history of the Appalachian coal mines is no longer a burden, it is a foundation. It is the stone upon which a new future is being built. The darkness of the mines has been replaced by the silver light of the moon. The struggle has been replaced by a deep, enduring rest. Feel the heavy, comforting weight of the mountain's silence. It is a silence that has been earned through a century of noise. It is a silence that tells you it is okay to let go. Like the abandoned tipples that are being swallowed by the forest, like the old roads that are becoming paths, you are allowed to return to the earth. You are allowed to be still. The stories are settled. The ghosts are at peace. The mountains are watching over you. The sacred keepers of the hollow. To reach the final heart of this 8,000-word odyssey, we must step away from the machines and the mines and enter the quietest room in the shack. We must talk about the women, the mine mothers, who were the true architects of survival in the face of absolute poverty. While the men were swallowed by the black throat of the mountain, the women were engaged in a different kind of mining, the mining of hope from despair. Imagine a woman named Hattie. It is 1935 and the winter wind is howling through the chinks in the cabin walls like a hungry wolf. Hattie has no money in her apron pocket, not even a tin scrip coin, but she has a kitchen garden that she has tended with a devotion that borders on the religious. In Appalachia, a garden wasn't a hobby, it was a fortress against starvation. She has spent the summer putting up jars of beans, corn and tomatoes. Imagine the pantry shelves, rows upon rows of glass jars glowing in the dim light like jewels. This was the Appalachian gold. Every jar represented a day of work under a blistering sun, a defense against the lean months of winter. When the company store cut off credit during a strike, these jars were the only thing standing between a family and the end of their story. The poverty forced a closeness with the earth that the modern world has long forgotten. Hattie knew the language of the woods. when her youngest child fell ill with a fever and there was no doctor for 50 miles and no money to pay one even if he existed, she didn't panic. She walked into the dark woods and found the ginseng and the yellow root. She brewed teas from the bark of the slippery elm and made poultices from crushed ramps. This was the medicine of the poor, a wisdom passed down through generations of grandmothers, a secret science that kept the hollows alive when the industrial world turned its back. The folklore of the deep shadows. In the absolute darkness of the mines, where the human eye can see nothing, the human mind begins to create. The poverty and danger of the Appalachian coal mines birthed a folklore so rich it still haunts the ridges today. To understand the miner, you must understand his ghosts. They spoke of the silver ghost of the shaft, a shimmering figure that would appear just before a cave-in, pointing toward the exit with a luminous finger. They spoke of the man in the flannel coat, a miner who had died in 1890, but still showed up to help young boys who had lost their way in the maze of the deep veins. These weren't scary stories to the miners, they were comforts. In a world where 1,000 feet of rock could crush you in a heartbeat, believing that the mountain had a spirit made the darkness feel less lonely. Think of the quiet superstitions. A miner would never whistle inside the mine, for it was said to call the rocks down. He would never allow a woman to enter the drift mouth, not out of prejudice, but out of a strange ancient reverence for the mountain mother who didn't want to be disturbed. They lived in a world of signs and omens. A bird flying into the house was a sign of a coming accident. A dream of white horses meant a funeral was near. This was how they processed the unpredictability of their lives. They turned the chaos of poverty and danger into a grand spiritual drama where they were the heroes. The great migration of the spirit. As the coal era began to wane in the late 20th century, the disappearance of the towns became a physical reality. We spoke of the hillbilly highway, but we must also speak of the spirit of the return. Thousands of families who had moved to the cities to escape the poverty found that they couldn't wash the coal dust from their souls. In the 1990s, a strange phenomenon began. Elderly men retired from the steel mills of Gary, Indiana, or the assembly lines of Flint, Michigan, began to drive back. They didn't come back for jobs, they came back for the silence. They brought back their families' old, dilapidated shacks. They cleared the briars from the graves of their fathers. Imagine an old man named Silas sitting on a porch in a town that has officially disappeared from the map. The post office is gone. The school is a shell. But Silas is happy. He listens to the rhythmic tink, tink, tink of a rain shower on his tin roof, and he feels a peace that the city could never give him. He is poor by the world's standards, living on a small pension in a house with a leaking roof, but he is home. In Appalachia, home is a holy word. It is the place where your umbilical cord is buried in the soil. It is the place where the mountain knows your name. The final reckoning of the coal. The true history of the American coal mines is a story of the great trade. The nation traded the health and the land of the Appalachian people for the electricity that lit the skyscrapers and powered the suburbs. It was a deal made in the dark, and the people of the hollows paid the price in black lung, in scrip, and in the loss of their beautiful ridges. But as we conclude this 8,000-word journey, look at what remains. The coal is mostly gone, and the big companies have moved their interests elsewhere. What is left is a reclaimed humanity. You see it in the community radio stations where the locals broadcast their own news and music. You see it in the literary festivals held in old coal-tippled towns where poets write about the beauty of the redbud spring. You see it in the seed swaps where people ensure that the ancient Cherokee Trail of Tears beans are planted for another year. The poverty was a fire that burned away everything that wasn't essential. What was left was the diamond, the unbreakable core of the Appalachian character. They are a people who know how to make something out of nothing. They know how to find a song in a tragedy. They know that the darkness is just a place where the light hasn't reached yet. The eternal lullaby of the hollow. Close your eyes now one last time. We are back at the head of the hollow. The 8,000 words we have shared are now just a part of the wind. The history of the small American town that slowly disappeared is not a tragedy of ending, but a poem of becoming. The town didn't disappear into nothingness. It disappeared into the everything of nature. The wooden boards became soil. The iron rails became rust that fed the moss. The people's stories became the echoes that you hear when the wind whistles through the high gaps in the ridges. Imagine the moon rising over the blue ridge. It is a giant silver coin, the only scrip that matters now. It illuminates the winding creek, the dark forests, and the quiet, sagging porches. The world is tucked in. The struggle is over. The mine wars are a memory. The black lung has finally found its rest. As you drift into your own deep sleep, feel the mountain cradling you. You are part of this history now. You have walked the red dog roads. You have sat in the breaker house. You have heard the lonesome whistle. You know the truth of the coal mines, that the richest things in life are the things that cannot be mined, sold, or taken away. Peace is the final inventory of the company store. Stillness is the final dividend of the coal.